Jakob Nielsen recently shared his prediction for what UX looks like in 2050. Here's his keynote speech from our virtual conference in 2020.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for joining us, in particular, of course, if it's in the middle of the night where you are. Since this is a February conference, I thought I would start by just briefly talking about Numa Pompilius, and he lived 2,700 years ago, and Numa Pompilius is responsible for the month of January and February, because before him, the year only had 10 months in the calendar, and that's actually why the months of September, October, November, and December are named after numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10 in Latin, because those were the numbers of those months at the time. And then Numa Pompilius introduced 2 more months, and not at the end. He put them at the beginning, so the numbering scheme was messed up. And also saddled us with February, which I think is a usability abomination of a month, so that has caused so much trouble for all the little children for 2,700 years in learning the calendar, so we can blame him for that. I just mentioned this story because it shows you how design decisions can sometimes last for a very long time, though I don't think most of the designs we work on will still be here in 2,700 years. But even so, that's why it makes sense to look ahead and talk about sort of a little bit of a longer term picture. And there are really 2 different ways we can consider problems. And so by way of example, I'm showing you 2 planets. We can look at planets or study them bottom up, like Earth was studied. Like first you get hold of like one rock and you can kind of house this rock, and then you maybe look at one volcano, one island. You build up to a bigger understanding of that planet until you get to things like continental drift and what have you. On the other hand, Mars was studied top down. And so in the beginning, people just knew it was a red planet. And we still actually don't have rocks from Mars, like under the microscope in the laboratories here. There are some missions up to try to collect them, but so far, no. Today, we're going to take that kind of Mars view, that big global view, not look at the individual rocks or individual volcanoes, individual screen designs and buttons and what have you. We're going to look at sort of a bigger picture scheme here. First, I always like to, when trying to look ahead, try to mirror it, flip it, and look back the same amount of years to get us an idea of what can happen in this time frame we're looking at. So 29 years ago, this screen I'm showing here, it was an example of a type of interface that we had at the time. So we had a multimedia, we had hypertext, but on CD-ROMs. The web had just barely been invented the year before, but it was very primitive. I actually saw the web demonstrated at a hypertext conference in 1991, and I was not very impressed. The web there was like 5 websites or something like that in the world. The next year, when the graphical browser was introduced, widely spread, that the web really took off. And also, like in terms of, like, for example, what were the famous computer companies at the time? Well, some of them are still famous, Microsoft, IBM, Apple. Others don't even exist anymore. Mobile, we had mobile devices, the flip phones. We didn't have smartphones. The data services were completely, extremely primitive. So in terms of what's kind of important now, there were just some very small kind of starting elements of that at the time. But it's very different, of course. But that means that if we look ahead to 2050, we can maybe expect that we can sort of see some trends, and that they may have some impact on what's going to happen. But that said, things are going to be very different as well. So that's why it makes sense to look that much ahead. So here I have a list of 10 of the most prominent technology companies right now. And I do say 10 of because, of course, there's no official list of the 10 most important companies or anything like that. But they are for sure 10 of the most important. And actually, the most important, interesting thing about this list is the companies marked with a star, because those are the ones that actually existed back in 1990. So most of them are new. And similarly, if we look ahead to 2050, we would expect, if we do a similar list then of what are the most important technology companies, most likely most of them are going to be companies that don't exist now. And so new things are going to happen. And one of the big things that I think is definitely going to happen is, we think about 2050, the economy of China is expected to be about 2.5 times as big as the economy of the United States. So we should expect, a lot more Chinese companies on this type of list. Also, maybe even more importantly, the economy of all of Asia put together will be about 3 times the economy of North America and Europe put together. So we should also expect companies from other places in Asia and not just from China. But of course, exactly which countries and exactly which companies and what they're going to be doing, that is very hard to say. But the main point I think that's important that we can recognize already now is dramatic, much more internationalization, globalization, broadening of where technology and innovation is going to come from compared to how it's been in the past, where it was very kind of isolated and monopolized. This chart shows the growth in gross national product per person. And I'm showing you this because this is the single most important parameter for human welfare and our standard of living. It's of course not the only one, but it's extremely highly correlated with almost all other things you might want to measure, like percentage of households that have indoor plumbing or air condition, infant mortality, amount of pollution. I mean, whatever you want to measure, it's usually very strongly correlated with this. So it's a single measure that's nice to have. And you can see that it's basically, this chart only goes back to the year 1700, but we can draw it back all the way back to the year 1, the age of the Roman Empire, and it would just be a flat line all the way going back, because that's how it's been for all of human history. 2 things, really. First of all, no change. 1 decade was the same as the other decade. I mean, gradually no change, but no change that you could actually feel. Of course, on the contrary, the reason it makes sense to talk about 2050 is we expect there will be change. So that's our current scenario. But that did not used to be the case. Also, it used to be the case that everybody was dirt poor. The line was like very, very, very close to 0. And of course, it's not literally true. There were a few members of the nobility who were rich. And of course, the king was very rich. You have to remember, though, even the king didn't get good Wi-Fi in the palace. But we have had this great improvement in welfare. And just to give you one example of how concrete of this, looking at the bag of flour, this is one of the very few products that's actually been the same for centuries, and where the benefit or utility for a person is the same. You can bake the same amount of bread now as you could back then, and you can eat the same amount of bread now as you could back then. So it's the same benefit. But back in 1500, an average worker had to work for 3 days to make enough money to buy, this kind of bag of flour. And today, an average worker, average being half make more, half make less, an average worker can buy 89 bags of flour for 1 day's salary. So you combine those two, and you can see that we are 266 times better off for the average worker. And this doesn't even take into account that a day's work in the year 1500 was much harder. I mean, being a farmhand in 1500 was very hard work compared to the jobs people have today. So total, this is an improvement of about 1.1% per year. So very little. And actually, that's probably comprised of about 0.1% improvement per year for the first 3 centuries, because again, things didn't change very much. And then the last 2 centuries, maybe more like 2% per year. Actually, just small percentages every year, they add up to huge advances. And it's not that it always only goes up. You can see here are kind of the dips for the recession that we're in right now. So there's certainly things can get worse, of course. But basically, they have been getting better. And it varies between countries when that started. In Europe, United States, it started around the year 1800. Things started really changing and getting better. In Singapore, not until around the year 1960. In China, not even until the year 1980 did they really start on that kind of improvement curve of things constantly getting better and better and better. And why is it getting better? Because it doesn't happen by itself. The reason we are so well off today is really to the credit of probably at least 1 million different people, individuals like engineers inventing a new product, or business people inventing a new way of meeting some new customer needs, or running their company more efficiently so people can afford the products that the engineers invented, and so forth. And so some of these million people are certainly more famous than others, but most of them we don't know. Well, Thomas Edison got 1,000 patents, very famous inventor, or Henry Ford, very famous business person, came up with a way of running his company so efficiently that normal people could afford to buy a car. And before that, it was just for rich people. So those are great individual improvements. But again, it's really the majority of the much smaller improvements that just add up and add up and add up. Because again, I mean, nobody uses a Thomas Edison light bulb today, right? We have these LED light bulbs that are like much brighter, use much less electricity, and they run for 10 years without breaking. So, and this is not like one person invented that light bulb and we threw out the old light bulbs from Thomas Edison, right? A lot of smaller improvements over the years since Edison. And so this is what we also would expect going forward. But there's an interesting kind of difference, I think. And so this chart is measured in money, but money is just a measurement unit for resources. And so it means how much can we do. So we're going to get much richer than we are now. We're already very rich compared to our ancestors, but we will get even more rich. And so when people get very rich, what happens is that they will demand quality. And UX is a quality discipline. We are the ones who are going to make these products and services better to satisfy these rich people that we're all going to be in the future. That's our job, our role. And this is why there will be much more demand for us in the future, is because people will be able to afford it. I mean, they will want better and better and even better things all the time because they're getting richer and richer and richer. Another thing that's also going to happen is that, again, these curves don't go up just by themselves. They go up because of improvements, innovation. And there will for sure still be innovation in other fields like agriculture, like a bag of flour will be even cheaper by 2050. Manufacturing industry will be improved as well, for sure. But a lot of these additional enhancements to the economy are going to come from us. Because now we are in a knowledge economy, mainly. We also have agriculture. We also have the other things, right? But we are to a great extent, in a knowledge economy. And to improve knowledge work, that is user experience work to make people more effective and efficient and innovative and just all these good things. That is our job. So I think both from the demand side and the supply side, we are going to be a very, very key part of this economic growth that's going to happen over the next 30 years or so. And so that's why I believe that there will be an enormous huge more use of UX, many more UX people, which we'll return to in a minute. But first, let's talk about the broadening of UX in terms of internationalization. So this chart here shows you the percentage of the world's population that's on the internet. And over only a 15-year period, which is pretty short time, it's gone up by a factor of 3. And so, of course, we cannot go up by a factor of 3 again when we're already at more than half, right? But we can almost double. And that's what I would predict will happen over the next 30 years. And I would predict that by 2050, we'll never get to 100% know exactly. There's always going to be a few people who don't want to go online. But I believe we'll get to the point where basically everybody all over the world, in all countries, are on the internet. And that means we have to design for them. And again, there's going to be this much broadening of the user base compared to what we have now, and particularly what we had, those 15 years ago. We can even see this just at our own conference, the UX conference, that we have people now coming from so many more countries and territories than we used to, even this just small amount of time for which I compiled the data. In 2015, we had people from 69 different countries, and last year we had 85 different countries. So it goes up, broader spread of UX, which I think is very happy, but it's one of those big trends that we are getting to be a much broader and much bigger field than we were in the past. So another prediction that's very safe is the distribution of the population by 2050, because most of the people who will be alive then are already alive. And so we know how many old people there will be because they're the middle-aged people now. Now, we don't know exactly how many young people there will be because they have not been born yet. But the people who work on specialize in studying these things, they have some pretty decent projections of it. And that's what I'm showing you here. And it varies between countries, but the broad conclusion is really the same, which is there will be more old people than young people. And that means that we have to design more for old people. And we don't do that well now. That's a big disgrace in the user experience field, I have to say, how we are ignoring elderly users. And it's even more so if you look at split this up now in not just old people, but young old people and old. And so the young old, you can see here, that's going to grow somewhat in most countries, except in Japan, actually, it's about the same because they already have a lot of old people. But the old people are going to be hugely more in all countries. And from a UX perspective, that is important because the young old people are actually not that different than middle-aged people in terms of what design they need. But for the old, 85 years and older people, we actually really do have to take a lot of special things into account when designing for them. And we don't do that very well now. And that's one of the things we really do have to change in the upcoming years because of the user population changing. So we have to change the design for the actual people. That's one of our main principles. So I'm predicting a broad increase in user experience workforce. And I'm going to take a kind of broad view, a 100-year view actually of this, going back to 1950 when the field started and going forward to the 2050. That's our kind of target date we're looking at here. And I'm going to look at the different levels of intelligence, our IQ intelligence quotient that's needed to do good UX work, because I think that has actually been changing over the years, which is an interesting point. And before I do that, I'll just have to first acknowledge that intelligence is not the only factor for how good people are at user experience. There are many other things that impact that too. But I'm talking about IQ here for two reasons. The first is that it is the number one most important number for any knowledge work, including user experience. But for all knowledge work, how smart you are is, the number one influence. And secondly, intelligence has been studied very, very detailed for about 100 years. And so we have very, very detailed knowledge about how many people exist in the world at different levels of intelligence. But before I go into that, let me just kind of acknowledge this point that intelligence is not the only thing. And so as a little example, I'm here looking at 3 different UX people. So person 1, person 2, and person 3. And each dot is one thing that person has done in a week. And furthermore, we're distributing those things according to their quality on a scale that I just made up, a 1 to 10 scale for how good the work product is. So work product, it could be like a screen design, it could be a research finding about users, it could be, copywriting, something content you wrote, depending on what sub-discipline of UX you're in, but just one thing the person has done. And it's definitely true that, things vary in quality and some things are better than others. And for even any given person, sometimes they do better than their average and sometimes they do worse than their average. But we have here these 3 people and there are 2 different averages. The person 1 and 2 have an average quality of 5.5 and person 3 has a little bit lower quality, unfortunately. And person 1 gets 22 things done in a week and person 2 and 3 get 44 things done in a week. Okay, given this data, if you're going to hire one person for your UX team, who should that be? Person 1, 2, or 3? Well, okay, the answer here is very obvious. It's person 2 because they get a lot done and it's high quality. Okay, let's say person 2 is not available. Now it becomes interesting. So we have only the choice between person 1 and person 3. Let me furthermore say as an assumption here, we are in a company that places very high value on high quality user experience. So that's our main goal, is high quality. Should you now hire person 1, they do less work, but it's high quality, or person 3, they do more work, but lower quality. And I want high quality. You might think then I should take person 1, but not so under one more assumption. And that assumption is we cannot actually deliver everything that the UX team can come up with. And I think this is a very realistic assumption because honestly, designers can design so many more things than the developers can ever actually implement, or the UX researchers can come up with so many more insights about users than we can ever actually design and deliver and implement and ship in the product. So for the sake of this argument, I'm just saying the top 10 things we can actually do and the rest we cannot do. And UX, we're kind of lucky that we could probably actually find the 10 best things because we have evaluation methods. So we know what's a good, better design than other designs. So if we only do the top 10 things, and now we compare person 1 and person 3, we see that the average quality of the top 10 things only is actually higher for person 3, even though their overall average quality is lower. And that's because they have a very large number of things that are not going to be done. And so what? It doesn't matter that they're lower quality, right? Because there's so many more things to choose from, the quality of those few things we can do ends up being higher. So that's one of the points. So it's not just talent, like hard work matters as well, and many other criteria as well matters as well. But let's go back to just looking at the IQ. So back in 1950, there was only a handful of people doing UX in the world. And it really started at Bell Laboratories, or Bell Labs, which was the research laboratory for the telephone companies in the United States. And Bell Labs was a truly highly, highly elite laboratory. It was probably the number one research lab ever in the history of humanity. They invented things like the transistor, the laser, the radio telescope, mobile cellular telephony, Unix, whether you like Unix or not, it was a major invention at the time, the touch-tone and push-button telephone, all these things, many, many, many more. Nobel Prize winners walked the hallways at this lab. It was really very, very super elite, and they hired only people with these kind of pretty close to genius level IQ. And so that was kind of lucky, because I'll give you an example of one of the projects that they worked on, which was, again, the touch-tone telephone, or the push-button telephone. And here we see some of the different layouts that they designed and they worked on. And luckily, they did the study. And so you can see that preferred is what show it to some customers. What telephone would you like? But that was not the one that was the best and the fastest for entering telephone numbers. That was actually the one that's here is marked as fast. And that's, you can see, this is the same one we have today. And so now, if I tell you, you cannot choose the best design just by showing some options to the customers and asking which one would you like. Honestly, we teach this on day one now, right? Everybody who does user experience knows that you can't just show things to customers and ask them what they want. You have to do observational research. We all know this. But now let's backtrack in time to the 1950s. They did not know that. This was the first sort of UX work for product design, and they didn't know anything of any of the things we know today. They had to discover all that. And that's why they had to be incredibly smart people of this kind of genius level research. And today we don't have to have that, because we know we have all these best practices. We know these things based on decades and decades of people already finding out. Another example from this early work, they also looked not just at the layout of the buttons, but also at the buttons themselves. So should you have big buttons or small buttons? Well, they discovered that big buttons, you can enter the phone number faster and you can make fewer errors. Now, do you need a big brain to design a big button? Today, no. Today, everybody who works at UX hopefully knows this rule that, bigger buttons are faster to push. I mean, Fitz's law and all this. Something we teach in the basic courses. And so all people do UX should at least know this and should design as big buttons as they can get away with. But back then, this was not known. How would you know that? It could be that small buttons were like, you don't have to move your finger so much, right? So nobody knows, or nobody knew, I should say. And therefore, they didn't know how to study this right, so they had to come up with all of that. And I'm very happy they did, that Bell Labs had these genius people, UX people, working on the push-button telephone, because that design that they came up with that we are still using today has been used approximately 40 trillion times. 40 trillion times of usage of this design since it was launched. And this means that by doing the better design, they have saved the world about 1 million person years. So those guys who did that study, that was, we've really benefited, humanity has benefited a lot from that work. But today we don't need to be, that smart. We still definitely have to be smart to do user experience. It's still difficult, but we don't have to be geniuses anymore. And I predict when we go forward, we can actually lower the intelligence requirements even more, because there'll be even more best practices to rely on. There'll be even more design patterns that we can start from when we want to design a new thing. I don't think we're going to go down to the point with an intelligence of quotient of 100, which is average, average intelligence. I don't think so. I don't think average people can do good user experience. It is inherently very complicated, very demanding of brain power, because you have so enormously many design dimensions. It's just one thing, bigger or smaller buttons. That would not be so hard, but there's 50 other things you've got to consider as well and put together in design. And that's very, very complicated to keep all of those different things in your brain at the same time. And also we have to do trade-offs between very vague criteria, conflicting criteria that are usually not very cleanly specified. So because of that, it is inherently rather difficult to do user experience. It's not going to be something for the average person off the street who can do this. But I do think that we don't need to be geniuses anymore already now, and in the future even less so. And that's lucky, because I do have this prediction that there will be enormously many more UX professionals in the world in the future. So right now, there's about 1.5 million of us. And that means that we are accounting for 1/3% of the world's workforce that has this high level of intelligence. And that's not so bad. 1/3% is not so bad. And I think it is a little bit hard to hire good UX people, but it's not because of lack of talent. It's because of lack of training. So we can deal with this. But going to the future, I think we'll have 100 million UX people in the world. And now we're talking about we're going to consume 11% of the world's smart people, or workforce, not retired people, but people in the workforce, 11%. And that's a high percentage for just one profession. I actually still think that's probably realistic, because I think there are a lot of other professions that now account for a large number of highly intelligent workforce that will require fewer people in the future, because artificial intelligence and computers and so forth will take over a lot of that knowledge work and make people much more efficient in many disciplines. And that means that there will be need for fewer of these other professions. But that doesn't mean there will be unemployment. That means that those people will be available to have our type of job. And so that's how I think that's going to play out, is that there'll be a rebalancing of the types of jobs that people do, where more of them will be doing user experience and fewer of them, still 89%, but fewer of them will be doing all the other types of jobs that are currently the high IQ jobs. In terms of what do we get out of this, a lot of people are working on UX, so what do we get in return? So this chart here shows you how much a design is improved in the various measurable metrics after you've applied good UX practices to the design. And we've studied this a few times. So the first two bars are actually data from our studies, and the last one is my prediction for the future. But the first time we studied it, we found that the design's measurable metrics improved by 247%, which is huge improvement, right? That's enormous improvement in design quality based on user experience. And now, last year we did the same study again, and now it's 75% improvement from doing good UX. Why is it that this improvement is so much lower? It's because back then, the designs were really so bad. Honestly, if you remember, there was a lot of terrible websites out there and other products as well. And so when you start from a very low baseline, you can improve it a lot. Nowadays, certainly not designs are still not perfect, but user interfaces are much better than they used to be. And so this means that if we apply our good best practices from starting from a higher point, we cannot improve them by quite as much. But 75% is still a good improvement in metrics from doing UX. Still, I think this is an example of misallocation of resources, that we don't do even more of this. Because we did another study to find out how many people on an average product team are actually UX professionals, designers or researchers. And that's on average 11%. Now, sometimes more, sometimes less, but on average 11%. Now, if 11% of the team improved the product by 75%, wow, you should do more of that, right? And so that's what I'm predicting in the future. And right now, I think it's a misallocation of resources that we don't do even more UX. But it takes a while to grow this. So my prediction is we're going to grow more and more UX people, but at the same time, picking all the low-hanging fruit and design getting better and better and better. And so the improvement will get lower and lower, unfortunately. But, honestly, so that make us feel like, well, UX is getting less and less important, but actually not so. Because what happens is that those 25% improvement will be applying to more and more things and more important things as well. So right now, my estimate is that UX, our profession, our field, contributes $500 billion per year to the world economy. And by 2050, I'm predicting that we will be contributing $10 trillion a year to the world economy. So vastly more. Each thing we do will have less impact, but then we'll do so many more things that the total impact, which is what matters, will be much bigger. Now, I want to end by telling you the story of the dodo bird. So the dodo is mainly famous for being extinct, sad to say for the poor bird, but it used to live on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. And before it became extinct, luckily there were a few ships that landed on this island and caught a few of these birds and took them back to museums. And they got stuffed. So you can see in the Natural History Museum in London, you can see the photograph I took on the left. That's a bird that's stuffed, and you can see it today. You can see how a dodo used to look in the museum. Now, these sailors who were sailing around the Indian Ocean, they also passed by another island in the Indian Ocean called Reunion Island. And they didn't land on this island, but they looked at it with their telescope, and they saw some big birds there. And they thought they looked a lot like the dodo bird that they had just caught in Mauritius. So they went back to London and talked to the guys at the museum and said, we saw a dodo bird on Reunion, but we didn't get to catch one for you, sorry. And so the museum people said, well, we want to have that Reunion Island dodo as well in the exhibit, but they didn't have one. So they just make up a fake bird. They made up a bird and stuffed and put that on display as well, with a little sign saying, here's the Reunion Island dodo. Now, it turns out that there is no dodo on Reunion Island. There never was a dodo on Reunion Island. So those sailors who spotted the bird in their telescope must have seen some other type of bird. Now, I have to say, to the credit of the Natural History Museum in London, they have now come clean about they made up a fake bird. And they have another sign on it now that says there was never this bird, but we made it up for this reason. So you can still see that fake bird today as a kind of a lesson in the downsides of making up things. And I think there should be a lesson to not just to the Natural History Museum, but also to us. Because UX, unfortunately, has a lot of fake birds. We have a lot of cases where we make up stories about users and say, well, people are going to use this, or they're going to like that, or they want this. And we don't know because we didn't study actual users. And that's what I would call a fake bird. And we have a lot of those, unfortunately, in our field as well. And I'm sad to say I'll predict we'll keep having those. Because the history of user experience is that every time we get a new technology or some new opportunity for design, it's like a 2-step forward, 1 step back scenario, which of course net is an improvement. But honestly, every time we get something new we can do, some people make up fake stories about users and then they do bad design, and we have to fix all of that. And that's a sad thing. And I really just predict that that's unfortunately going to continue. I think that's an unfortunate scenario. But that said, remember that by 2050, I'm predicting we will have 100 million UX people in the world. And so this means that there will be an extremely large number of new insights, new user insights, new design ideas, various improvements in the user interface coming out, and some fake birds, fake data, bad design coming out as well. Yes, but also a great number of good ones. And now, user experience, we're actually lucky that we have design Darwinism. The survival of the fittest, or at least survival of the most usability, which is that users will go where it's easy, where they're treated well, where things are nice for them. If they get a bad design, they'll use it less, or they'll stop using it, or they will not go to that website more than once. If it's a good design, they'll come back and use it more. And so the design Darwinism is that gradually, the good user experience actually wins, but there is temporarily a lot of bad mutations as well that we have to suffer under. But design Darwinism means that eventually we get better. That's why that prediction of having so much innovation in the world is extremely positive, because that means that so many ideas, and so from which we can cull, kind of the best ones. Now, because of all of these changes, my ultimate prediction about user experience is that we are going to be the Little Mermaid. We're going to be like the Little Mermaid. When I say the Little Mermaid, I mean the original fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen. I don't mean the kind of prettified movie that was made later. But in the original fairy tale about the Little Mermaid, the ending is actually kind of tragic, because, or at least bittersweet, because yes, she gets the prince, but at a very high cost, at the cost of everything that made her special. She has to become human, and she loses, she can't swim with the fishes and all the various things that used to make her special. She has lost all of that. And I think this is what's going to happen to us as well. We will lose what used to make us special. We used to be special because we were a very small elite, very few people who knew how to make designs and websites work. Most people didn't and made terrible products. We were the few people who knew how to make it better. Whenever we worked on something, man, several 100% improvements. It was like, wow, wow, wow. Here comes the UX and we are the heroes and we will just make things so much better. Well, as I said, my prediction is we will make things only a little better in the future because it's going to get already much better. And there will be so many innovations that each individual thing we work on is not going to be so much. We're not going to be special. There's going to be 100 million of us. So is that good or bad? I think ultimately it's good because there is that prize. The Little Mermaid, she won the prince. We're going to win the world. We are going to make, the world so much better for, the broad masses of humanity and improve, so many, many, many things. And we're going to be normal, common, the way it's done. We're not going to be that special, elite, unusual thing anymore. But I think ultimately that honestly is for the best. So that's what I predict for the future of user experience. Thank you very much.